The conference room fell silent the moment the attorney unfolded the final page of the will. Outside, rain tapped softly against the tall windows, but inside, every pair of eyes remained fixed on the polished mahogany table where a lifetime of memories was about to become lines of legal text. Margaret Hayes had lived quietly without children or fanfare, yet everyone knew she had accumulated extraordinary wealth over decades. Her relatives had arrived wearing expensive smiles, already imagining which pieces of her fortune would soon belong to them. One by one their expectations came true. Her eldest nephew inherited the waterfront mansion overlooking the harbor. A cousin received a thriving investment portfolio worth millions. Another relative smiled with satisfaction after hearing she now owned priceless artwork collected across 4 continents. Every announcement filled the room with relieved laughter and whispered congratulations. Emma sat near the end of the table, saying nothing. She had visited Aunt Margaret more often than anyone else, never asking for money, never expecting a reward. Even so, she assumed there might be a small keepsake, perhaps an old watch or one of the family photographs they had cherished together. The attorney adjusted his glasses before reading the final bequest. To my niece, Emma Collins, I leave my beach cottage on Blackwater shore. For a heartbeat, nobody reacted. Then the room erupted with muffled chuckles. The old shack. I thought that place should have fallen into the ocean years ago. What a generous gift. Heat rushed into Emma's face. She remembered the neglected cottage well. Salt-stained walls, a leaking roof, peeling paint, and endless repairs. It wasn't just forgotten. It was practically worthless. She forced a polite smile, thanked the attorney, and gathered her handbag, eager to escape the pitying glances surrounding her. As she reached the doorway, a calm voice stopped her. Miss Collins. The attorney waited until the others had disappeared into the hallway before stepping closer. There is one instruction your aunt insisted I deliver privately. Emma looked at him, confused. He lowered his voice. She said that no matter what anyone offers you, under absolutely no circumstances should you sell that cottage immediately. Before Emma could ask why, the attorney simply folded the document, offered a knowing nod, and walked away, leaving her alone with a question far more valuable than the inheritance itself. 3 days later, Emma steered her aging sedan down a narrow coastal road that seemed forgotten by time. The closer she came to Blackwater shore, the quieter the world became. The crashing waves drowned out civilization, while salty air drifted through her open window carrying the scent of seaweed and weathered wood. She expected to find little more than a collapsing structure waiting to be condemned. Instead, the cottage stood stubbornly against the wind, battered but unbroken. Its faded blue paint peeled from sun-bleached walls, and the porch leaned slightly toward the sea as though listening to every tide. The place looked neglected, yet strangely alive, refusing to surrender despite decades of storms. Inside, dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon light. Every room felt untouched, as if Aunt Margaret had simply stepped outside for a walk. Framed family photographs lined the shelves. Handwritten journals filled an old bookcase beside carefully rolled nautical maps tied with faded ribbon. A brass compass rested on the fireplace mantel, polished recently enough to catch her eye. Someone had loved this cottage far too deeply to abandon it. As Emma unpacked a small suitcase, a knock echoed across the quiet house. An elderly couple stood outside, introducing themselves as neighbors. Their smiles seemed warm, but their questions felt oddly cautious. So, the man asked after a long pause, are you planning to stay, or just looking around? Emma admitted she wasn't sure. The couple exchanged a glance neither bothered to explain. Before leaving, the woman looked toward the shoreline and quietly said, your aunt never wanted to leave this place. Not even when everyone else did. Everyone else? Emma watched them disappear down the road before returning inside, unsettled. Later that evening, curiosity drew her to one of the nautical maps. Comparing it with a modern map on her phone, she frowned. Several rocky inlets, an old lighthouse trail, and even a narrow strip of coastline appeared on Margaret's hand-drawn chart, but nowhere on the official version. Standing beside the window, listening to the relentless waves, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the cottage wasn't hiding treasures inside its walls. It was guarding secrets beyond them. The following morning arrived wrapped in dense ocean mist. Emma spent hours sweeping sand from the warped wooden floors, opening stiff windows, and carefully stacking Aunt Margaret's journals onto the dining table. The work was exhausting, but every room slowly revealed its quiet charm. It was still an aging cottage with endless repairs ahead, yet it no longer felt worthless. It felt loved. Just after noon, the low growl of an engine broke the peaceful rhythm of the waves. A sleek black SUV rolled slowly up the gravel driveway, its glossy finish looking strangely out of place beside the weather-beaten cottage. A sharply dressed man stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of practiced smile that belonged in corporate boardrooms, not forgotten coastlines. "Miss Collins?" he asked politely. "My company specializes in premium coastal acquisitions. We'd like to purchase your property today." Emma blinked in surprise. "You haven't even looked inside." "We won't need to." He calmly opened the briefcase and slid a contract across the porch railing. The number printed near the bottom made her heart skip. $5 million. For a cottage everyone had laughed at only days before. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. "There isn't." His confidence unsettled her more than the offer itself. He never admired the view, never inspected the building, never asked about its condition. It was as though the cottage itself didn't matter. Emma slowly pushed the contract back toward him. "I'm not interested." For the first time his smile faltered. "If you change your mind, call the number inside. This offer won't remain available forever." He climbed back into the SUV and disappeared down the coastal road. By sunset, Emma was still replaying the conversation when another luxury vehicle stopped outside. This visitor skipped the introductions. "My clients authorized me to increase the offer immediately," the woman said, handing over a new envelope. Emma unfolded the document. $8 million. Her hands trembled. 2 extraordinary offers in a single day for a crumbling beach cottage made no sense at all. As the second vehicle disappeared into the gathering darkness, Emma looked toward the restless ocean, realizing someone wasn't trying to buy an old house. Someone was racing to obtain something hidden before she discovered what it was. Sleep refused to come that night. Every time Emma closed her eyes, the contracts flashed through her mind. $5 million. Then 8. No one offered fortunes for a cottage with a leaking roof unless the cottage wasn't what they were truly buying. The next morning, she drove into the nearest town and headed straight for the county records office. Dusty filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers filled with yellowing deeds, surveys, and handwritten property ledgers stretching back generations. Hours passed as she compared the official documents with the faded nautical maps she had found inside the cottage. Something immediately stood out. The oldest records showed the property extending far beyond the cottage itself, reaching sections of coastline that no longer appeared on modern surveys. Yet each newer document quietly reduced those boundaries without explaining why. There were no court orders, no sales, no legal transfers. It was as if pieces of the land had simply vanished on paper. The mystery deepened when she visited the local historical archive. Several coastal maps from decades earlier matched her aunt's drawings almost perfectly, including trails, rock formations, and an old lookout point erased from every recent publication. Driving home, Emma noticed fresh real estate signs scattered along neighboring properties. Construction surveyors were measuring fields, while unfamiliar vehicles stopped at nearly every nearby house. The developers weren't interested only in her cottage. They were buying everything surrounding it. Late that afternoon, while standing on the porch, she caught movement near the dunes. A lone figure watched the cottage through binoculars before disappearing behind the tall beach grass the moment she looked directly toward them. A chill settled over her. That evening, she found an envelope tucked beneath the front door with no name or return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Leave now. Before it's too late. Nothing else." Emma read the message twice before looking through the darkened windows toward the moonlit shoreline. The wind howled across the empty beach, carrying a feeling she could no longer dismiss. Someone was frightened she would uncover the truth, and someone else was willing to frighten her first. The anonymous warning stayed on Emma's mind long after sunrise, but fear no longer outweighed curiosity. If someone wanted her gone, then the answers had to be inside the cottage. She carried Aunt Margaret's journals to the kitchen table, brushed away a thin layer of dust, and opened the oldest worn leather notebook. At first, the entries spoke of ordinary days. Morning walks along the shore. Migrating seabirds. The changing tides. Then the tone shifted. I refused another offer today, one page read. They don't want the cottage. They want what the cottage protects. Emma turned the page faster. Her aunt described attending town meetings where wealthy investors promised jobs and prosperity while quietly pushing plans to transform the untouched coastline into a private luxury development. Margaret had joined local conservation groups, arguing that the shoreline carried historical and environmental significance that couldn't be replaced once destroyed. Several entries mentioned exhausting legal battles. Lawyers appeared without warning. Surveyors arrived uninvited. Important records vanished from government offices, only to reappear altered months later. Again and again, powerful buyers tried to persuade her to sell, and every time she refused. One sentence had been underlined so heavily the ink had nearly torn through the paper. They are trying to erase the original coastal claim. If they succeed, no one will ever know who truly owns this land. Emma leaned back, her pulse quickening. What original claim? The next journal contained newspaper clippings about forgotten court hearings and handwritten notes connecting names of politicians, developers, and law firms with arrows drawn between them. Margaret had spent years documenting patterns no one else seemed willing to see. Toward the back of the final journal rested a sealed envelope addressed simply to Emma. Inside was a brief handwritten letter. If you're reading this, they finally know I'm gone. That means they'll come for the cottage immediately. I didn't leave it to you because it was easy to keep. I left it because I believed you would ask the questions everyone else was too afraid to ask. Emma folded the letter carefully, staring toward the endless ocean. For the first time, she realized this inheritance had never been an accident. It had been a carefully planned responsibility waiting for the right person to accept it. Within 2 days, the atmosphere around the cottage changed completely. The cheerful representatives with polished smiles disappeared, replaced by certified letters stamped with legal warnings. Thick envelopes arrived every morning, claiming boundary disputes, zoning concerns, and possible code violations. Each document demanded immediate responses, threatening expensive lawsuits if she failed to comply. Emma's attorney confirmed something unsettling. None of the claims had real substance, but defending against them could drain months of time and thousands of dollars. Then the inspectors arrived. They introduced themselves as county officials, carrying clipboards and official-looking badges. Something about them felt rehearsed. When Emma requested identification, one man hesitated before mumbling an excuse and quickly leaving with his partner. A phone call to the county office confirmed her suspicion. No inspectors had been assigned to Blackwater shore. That evening, the lights flickered twice before the electricity failed entirely. The following morning, the water stopped running. Utility companies insisted there were no scheduled outages, yet repairs somehow took days. Every inconvenience seemed carefully timed to wear down her patience rather than force her out. As if that weren't enough, relatives who had barely spoken to her in years suddenly began calling. "You've already won," one cousin insisted. "Take the money before they change their minds." Another warned, "People don't offer millions forever. You're being stubborn." Their concerns sounded strangely rehearsed, almost as though someone else had given them the same script. But instead of decreasing, the offers continued climbing. 10 million, 15 million, 22 million. No ordinary negotiation worked that way. Late one afternoon, Emma noticed a construction schedule accidentally left inside one of the legal packets. Most of the pages were blank, except for one highlighted date circled and read only 3 weeks away. Whatever the developers were planning had to begin before that deadline. For the first time, Emma understood the truth. They weren't pressuring her because she was running out of time. They were. And every passing day brought them closer to losing something worth far more than the millions they kept placing on her doorstep. She folded the schedule carefully and looked toward the cottage where her aunt had stood her ground for decades. Now she finally understood why. The circled deadline haunted Emma's thoughts until she could no longer ignore the questions buried beneath her feet. If Aunt Margaret had spent decades protecting this place, then the answers were likely hidden where no impatient buyer would think to look. Armed with a flashlight and an old pry bar, Emma returned to the living room, remembering the slightly raised floorboard she had noticed on her first day. After carefully lifting it, she uncovered a narrow wooden compartment sealed against moisture. Inside lay a weathered leather tube containing hand-drawn survey maps, brittle parchment copies of land grants, and a brass surveyor's compass wrapped in faded cloth. Tucked beneath them was a note in Margaret's handwriting. "They'll search the walls before they ever think to search the floor." Emma spread the maps across the dining table. Unlike the simplified charts in the county archives, these were astonishingly detailed. Every cliff, inlet, tidal creek, and rocky outcrop had been measured with remarkable precision. Bright red boundary lines stretched far beyond the cottage, reaching miles along the untouched coastline. The next morning she followed the maps on foot. Some landmarks had changed, but others remained exactly where Margaret had marked them decades earlier. An ancient stone marker, nearly swallowed by wild grass, matched a symbol on the survey. Farther along the cliffs, she found rusted iron stakes driven deep into the earth, each engraved with initials dating back more than a century. They weren't random markers. They were legal boundary monuments. Emma photographed everything before meeting an independent surveyor recommended by her attorney. After comparing the historic records with modern satellite data, the surveyor grew unusually quiet. "If these documents are authentic," he finally said, "your property isn't limited to that cottage." He traced a finger across the faded map. "These historical access rights extend across nearly the entire undeveloped shoreline. Any company planning a large coastal project would need your legal permission to use this corridor." Emma stared at the coastline spreading beyond the window. The developers hadn't been chasing an old beach cottage. They had been chasing the single piece of land standing between them and the largest luxury development on the entire coast. And now, for the first time, the battle was no longer about family memories. It was about the law. The countdown had begun. With only weeks remaining before the mysterious date circled in red, every hour suddenly carried weight. Emma's attorney confirmed that the land registry would soon close a filing window for historical boundary claims. If the original documents were not verified and recorded before that deadline, decades of altered records could become far more difficult to challenge. News of her discovery spread faster than she expected. Within days, developers requested an urgent meeting at a luxury hotel overlooking the harbor. Waiting inside was a polished executive surrounded by lawyers and financial advisors. His smile was confident, but the strain in his eyes betrayed growing desperation. "We're prepared to offer $80 million, he said, sliding a revised contract across the table. "Sign today and this all ends peacefully." Emma didn't even reach for the pen. "If everything is as simple as you claim," she replied, "why are you in such a hurry?" Silence filled the room. The executive calmly withdrew the contract, but his expression hardened. The negotiation was over. The battle had only begun. The following morning, legal notices arrived accusing Emma of filing fraudulent claims and interfering with approved development plans. Her attorney expected the move. "They're trying to overwhelm you before the evidence becomes official," he explained. Refusing to back down, Emma assembled a team her aunt would have admired. An independent historian authenticated the century-old land grants. Licensed surveyors confirmed the original boundary markers still matched the forgotten maps. Her attorney worked through sleepless nights preparing every affidavit, photograph, and historical record for submission. Meanwhile, corporate lawyers filed motions almost daily, hoping delays alone would push the deadline beyond reach. The pressure became relentless, but so did Emma's determination. On the final afternoon before the registry closed, she carried the restored documents into the county records office herself. As the clerk carefully stamped each page, she felt years of hidden history returning to its rightful place. Outside the courthouse, black SUVs lined the street. Their owners had arrived too late. And somewhere inside those vehicles, powerful people were realizing their carefully guarded secret was beginning to unravel. 2 days after the documents were officially recorded, the truth exploded into the open. Emma sat inside her attorney's office as certified survey reports, historical deeds, and independent valuations covered the conference table. Every expert reached the same conclusion. The forgotten beach cottage had never been the true prize. It was the legal gateway to a protected coastal corridor stretching across miles of undeveloped shoreline. Any large-scale construction project required access through land controlled by her property rights. Without Emma's signature, the entire luxury development was impossible. Years of planning, environmental permits, investor commitments, and billions in projected revenue rested on a single weather-beaten cottage everyone had mocked. Suddenly, every strange event made perfect sense. The altered maps, the disappearing records, the relentless pressure, the anonymous threats, even the laughter during the reading of the will. Someone had counted on her believing the cottage was worthless long enough to sell it before discovering the truth. That afternoon, the developers requested one final meeting. This time, there were no rehearsed smiles or empty promises. The company's chief executive entered personally, accompanied by attorneys, financial officers, and a professional appraiser. A thick folder was placed in front of Emma. "We've completed an independent valuation," the executive said quietly. "Your legal rights make this project impossible without your cooperation." Emma opened the folder. The number printed across the final page stole the breath from her lungs. $85 million. $85 million. For a cottage everyone had dismissed as a collapsing shack. The executive leaned forward. "We underestimated what your aunt knew," he admitted. "We also underestimated you." Emma remained silent. For the first time since inheriting the property, the balance of power had completely shifted. The people who had tried intimidation, deception, and legal pressure were now waiting for her decision. She looked through the office window toward the distant coastline where Aunt Margaret had spent decades standing alone against impossible odds. She finally understood why her aunt had never surrendered. This was never just about money. It was about protecting something powerful people believed they could quietly erase. Emma closed the folder without signing a single page. The offer of $85 million answered every question that had haunted her since the day of the will. But it also created the most important question of all. Now that she knew the truth, what was the coastline truly worth to the generations who would come after her? The offer remained untouched on Emma's kitchen table for 2 days. Most people would have seen only the staggering figure printed across the contract. $85 million could erase every financial worry she would ever face. Yet each time she reached for a pen, her eyes drifted instead toward the final bundle of letters Aunt Margaret had left behind. She untied the faded ribbon and unfolded the first page. "My dear Emma, if they've offered you an unimaginable fortune, then you've already discovered what this place truly means. But before you decide, ask yourself one question. Are they buying your land or your silence?" Another letter revealed the purpose behind the inheritance. Margaret had never wanted the coastline locked behind private gates or transformed into another playground for the wealthy. She believed some places belonged to history, wildlife, and ordinary families as much as they belonged to any legal owner. Leaving the cottage to Emma had been her final test, not of intelligence but of character. Emma closed the letters, her decision becoming clear. At the next meeting, the developers arrived expecting another negotiation over price. Instead, Emma slid a different document across the table. "If you want my signature," she said calmly, "these conditions come first." The room fell silent as their attorneys read each page. Permanent environmental protection for the fragile dunes and wetlands. Guaranteed public access to the shoreline. Restoration of the historic lighthouse trail and preservation of every documented landmark. A community trust funded to support local schools, conservation projects, and small businesses for generations. Not one condition mentioned increasing the purchase price. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. They had prepared to bargain with money, not principles. Hours of tense discussion followed. For the first time, Emma watched the powerful men and women who had once tried to intimidate her asking for compromises instead. The underdog they had dismissed now controlled every conversation. As the meeting ended, the chief executive quietly gathered the papers. "We came here believing we were negotiating for land," he admitted. Emma met his eyes without hesitation. "No," she replied. "You're negotiating for the privilege of becoming part of its future." And for the first time since this journey had begun, everyone in the room understood that the greatest value of the coastline could never be measured in dollars alone. The weeks that followed changed Blackwater Shore forever. Once the historical records became public, investigators reopened files that had been ignored for decades. Audits uncovered altered property maps, missing registry documents, and unauthorized boundary revisions hidden beneath layers of official paperwork. Several public officials were suspended while independent investigators traced a trail of corruption reaching far beyond the quiet coastal town. The truth Aunt Margaret had protected for so many years could no longer be buried. News of the investigation spread quickly. The same relatives who had laughed when Emma inherited the worthless cottage suddenly found themselves avoiding her calls and lowering their eyes whenever their paths crossed. Their embarrassment had little to do with the fortune she could have claimed. It came from realizing they had measured Margaret's legacy by money instead of meaning. One evening, the elderly neighbors who had first welcomed Emma returned to the cottage carrying a homemade pie. The old man sighed as they sat on the porch overlooking the sea. "We wanted to tell you everything years ago," he admitted. "But people who asked too many questions lost jobs, faced lawsuits, or simply gave up. Your aunt stayed because she believed someone had to." His wife smiled gently. "She always said the right person would come one day. We just didn't know it would be you." Emma felt a quiet ache in her chest. Margaret had spent years standing almost alone, yet she had never stopped believing the truth would outlive fear. As the months passed, newspapers praised Emma's determination, but the recognition never focused on the money or the remarkable offer she had received. Instead, people admired the courage of an ordinary woman who refused to surrender when powerful interests expected her to. Standing outside the restored cottage one peaceful evening, Emma watched families walking freely along the shoreline, children laughing where fences might have stood. Justice had arrived in more than one form. The corrupt were finally being held accountable. The forgotten history had been restored. And the legacy everyone once dismissed as worthless had become a lasting reminder that the greatest victories belong to those who choose truth over easy fortune. Months later, the little cottage overlooking Blackwater Shore no longer looked forgotten. The faded paint had been restored, the porch stood strong once again, and flowers bloomed where tangled weeds had once fought against the sea breeze. Yet despite every improvement, Emma had deliberately preserved its quiet character. She wanted it to remain exactly what Aunt Margaret had loved, a simple home with an extraordinary story. Some evenings, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the waves roll across the shoreline. It was impossible not to remember the day she had left the lawyer's office feeling embarrassed, convinced she had inherited the least valuable piece of her aunt's estate while everyone else celebrated their fortunes. She could still hear the laughter, still see the pity in their eyes. Now she understood how completely they had mistaken value for appearance. The greatest inheritance had never been hidden beneath the land or measured by the $85 million offer. It lived inside the courage Margaret had passed on, the wisdom to question what seemed obvious, and the responsibility to protect something larger than herself. Visitors often asked why she had fought so hard when accepting the money would have been easier. Emma always smiled before looking toward the endless horizon. Because some things become priceless the moment they're lost. Children played freely along the beach. Families explored the restored lighthouse trail. Wildlife returned to protected dunes that would have disappeared beneath concrete. The coastline had become a place where history, nature, and community could exist together, just as Margaret had imagined. Emma realized that legacies were never built by what people kept for themselves. They were built by what they chose to preserve for others. As the sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon, its golden light washed over the cottage that had changed everything. Sometimes the inheritance everyone laughs at becomes the future everyone wishes they had protected. And that is exactly why the smallest gift can leave the greatest legacy.